Welcome back to our Farm Green webinar series. My name is Nathan McClure and I am a placement student working with Donmeats and Dunbia. I'm delighted to be joined today by Hattie McFadzean, Senior Sustainability Consultant at Promar International, who will be sharing some of her knowledge around the benefits of carbon footprints. Hattie holds a master's in climate science and has previously worked with farmers in Burma, helping them to address their resilience challenges caused by drought and coastal erosion. Now Senior Sustainability Consultant at Promar International, Hattie specialises in carbon accounting, climate resilience, and net zero pathways in both the dairy and beef sectors. And in her spare time, she is working on her Nuffield Scholarship, looking into how the UK dairy sector can prepare to become resilient against our changing weather systems. Here at Dunbia, we believe carbon footprinting can help our farmer suppliers and provides them an opportunity to increase their farm's financial performance while also increasing their sustainability. During this webinar, we hope to share how carbon footprinting can benefit your farm through identifying how you can reduce costs and improve your business efficiency. And with that, I'll now hand over to Hattie to share a bit more about the benefits of carbon footprinting.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for that. That was a very kind introduction. I'm really, really pleased to be part of this Farm Green webinar series. I think it's an important thing and a kind of initiative that's going on. So I'll just share my screen and we'll get started with the benefits of carbon footprints that I'm going to be going through today. So as Nathan alluded to, carbon footprints make up a lot of my time as a sustainability consultant, and for right reasons, really. I'm going to start with looking at why on earth we're talking about carbon, and the vast majority of people that are kind of joining this webinar series will already be familiar with the reasons why we're talking about carbon ever so suddenly in the agricultural space, and it's because of this chart here. I don't want it to be too anxiety inducing, but what this chart shows is an average temperature between 1900 and 2000. It takes an average temperature for that 100-year range. And then it basically depicts how variable our average temperature per year has been in comparison to the last century. So what you can see before 1938 is a lot of our years have been under this average. So they were cooler than what we experienced in the last century. And then ever since about 1979, a few years into Industrial Revolution, we have this massive spike of temperatures that are above the average that we experienced in the last century, which is crucial to understand that this is not natural. We have natural carbon cycles and natural temperature ranges on our planet, but this is massively accelerated in comparison to those. So a lot of scientists and a lot of us have done a lot of digging as to why this is increasing. And essentially, we are burning carbon quicker at the rate that it is stored in the planet. Carbon in the atmosphere, therefore, increases a lot of our warming and captures what we call radiative forcing. So when we talk about carbon, two industries are mentioned a lot, and it might be a bias on myself operating in the agriculture industry, but it seems very often fossil fuels are mentioned in the same conversations as agriculture are, which, as someone who studied climate science and has an agriculture in the family, I found a bit jarring at first. And I'm not here to knock that fossil fuel industry too hard. I am a consumer of petrol and so on and so forth. But the main difference here between agriculture and fossil fuels is that a lot of the carbon released and methane released in agriculture is part of this biogenic carbon cycle. So the main culprit in livestock agriculture due to our ruminants is this methane. And we're very worried about methane because it's a lot more potent than carbon. However, I know a lot of the arguments against why we're talking about carbon in terms of agriculture is because of this biogenic methane cycle. Methane is released from our ruminants and then it is absorbed in our soils again. The problem is that this carbon cycle is now ineffective, not a one-to-one ratio. So a lot of our agriculture, we've become very, very good at farming, and that's something that we need to celebrate. And the productivity in the UK and efficiency that we do that with is really, really good, and that's fantastic. But we're releasing a lot of that methane into the air, and we do not have the trees or the carbon stocks in our soil that are necessarily mimicking what we want to happen with that methane that we are releasing. And we've seen soil organic matter deplete in our soils for a long time, and now we're indicating that a lot of that is recovering in the UK, which again is fantastic and is something to really celebrate. So this is the picture. There's a lot of consumers, a lot of people, a lot of farmers, everybody who is concerned about it, and we apply a lot of pressure on our governments to sign up to treaties and commitments. And the UK Climate Change Act of 2008 was the first commitment of the UK that legally bound us to do something about carbon. And that something started with monitoring. So the government puts pressure on our large companies and says you need to monitor your emissions, and ideally you need to monitor your emissions that you inherit from the goods that you procure from your supply chain. So this then, the request for information goes to our processors, such as Dunbia. The request for that information on more granular data may then come to farmers. And similarly, for farmers watching this webinar, you then, if you want to make sustainable decisions about, let's say, your feed inputs, you may request data from your suppliers and your feed suppliers. So we've got this request for information that is basically it is then leading to this carbon footprinting movement that we're seeing in the agriculture industry. And pigs and dairy are a little ahead of the curve, and then beef and lamb is expected to kind of match that kind of frequency of carbon footprinting going forward. So we produce carbon footprints. That's what people like myself do, and experts in the sector. We work to understand the carbon intensity of beef, lamb, and dairy for myself, and then others that focus on pork. And from this, we can come up with UK average emissions of carbon. And we have here for, let's take the example of lamb, we've got 29.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So CO2 equivalent includes carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide. So we've got 29.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of dead weight, of kilogram of meat that we produce. And then we can compare it to the global averages. So let's look at lamb again. The global average here is now 39.72. That's 10 kilograms of carbon per kilogram of meat more than what we're doing. So what on earth does that mean? Does it mean that we're more efficient? If we're more efficient on carbon, does it also mean we're more efficient at producing that meat? Well, I would argue yes. In a lot of cases, it's an indication of how efficient we are, and we should celebrate how well we're doing in the UK. But because we work so closely to the land, and that's a lot of things, that's something that other kind of sectors that are also under fire, such as the fossil industry, can't do. Working with the land and working to reduce our carbon efficiency is a really good opportunity for us to say, hey, look, public, we understand the concerns here and we can do something about it. We're already quite carbon efficient, but let's lead the way. Let's be innovative and reduce that further. And I know that the biggest criticism of the conversation that we're having at the minute is because we're not mirroring the same amount of conversation around this carbon sequestration piece. How much carbon are we absorbing in our soils? And the reason we're not doing that is because it's very complicated to estimate on a per farm basis. So there are a lot of very good people working on the matter at the minute, especially in the soil exchange, trying to come up with a quick way that we can say, okay, we might be producing 29.5 kilograms of carbon per kilogram of meat, but actually how much are we sequestering at the same time? So I'm going to park that for a second and just look at carbon. So you can see from this graph here, we're pretty carbon efficient on lamb already in the UK. And the purpose of this webinar is really to say, does that translate into productivity and efficiency of lamb production in general? So in order to investigate this, we want to look at how our carbon footprint is calculated. So this is a very crude kind of example of how a carbon footprint is calculated. You have three elements of your lamb production. So you've got the inputs on the left-hand side in red here. So those are all things that you buy onto your farm, and it comes with inherited carbon cost. It has taken somebody some resources to produce that concentrate feed or that fertilizer or bedding material, or that purchased animal. If you are fattening lambs, then it comes with a carbon emissions factor already when you purchase that lamb. So these are all the inputs. You are bringing carbon onto your farm, so to speak. You then have to do something with those inputs. You have to keep your sheep alive. You have to keep them fertile and reproducing, and then you have to feed them. And the majority of us will be feeding them on homegrown feed, whether that's grass or anything else. And then you also have to do something with the manure, especially when they're inside. When they're outside, the manure gets deposited onto grazing ground and it is naturally broken down and turned into organic matter. When they're inside, we've got to do something with that manure. And all of that kind of emits a carbon content. Then you've got your outputs. So you produce live lambs if you're selling them to somebody else to fatten up. You produce meat if they're going to slaughter, and you produce wool. Wool prices, I think, peaked, it was at 1955 or something like that, but you're still producing a product here. So all of that carbon that you've inherited on farm, and then you've built upon it by keeping your sheep healthy, alive, and fattening them up, you're splitting between the products that you are producing on your farm. So we can already inherently see how linked carbon and efficiency is on farm. If you can buy less inputs and still produce the same outputs, then you are more efficient. And that's what a lot of us are working towards. It means exactly the same thing with carbon than it does with cost, which is fantastic. So when it comes to recommending how to improve your carbon footprint, we then might want to look at, okay, if carbon efficiency seems to be linked with on-farm efficiency, what recommendations can kind of hit both nails on the head? And I've come up with these three boxes here. So number one is likely to be cost efficient. These are recommendations that will reduce your carbon, are likely to reduce your carbon, and also will be cost efficient in nature. They go through things like utilizing your land effectively. I think we all know that if you try and utilize your land in a way that your land cannot support, then it's not very efficient on farm. Reducing age at slaughter, you are reducing the number of days that you are feeding that animal, and therefore you're saving that carbon cost and that price cost. Enhance fertility. If we can get our sheep to have 2 lambs ideally instead of 1, then it's something we all strive for. Feed efficiency, I'm going to go into a little bit later. Improved silage grass quality, treating your FYM, so seeing if we can lock in that carbon. It's quite an interesting one to put in that likely cost efficient element, because if we can lock in that carbon and lock in that nitrogen, then our plants can utilize it more. Reducing mortality and disease, and understanding grass intake, so rations and that kind of thing is really an important recommendation that we have seen hits both that cost efficient element and carbon efficient element at the same time. You've then got a couple of other boxes. So is it cost efficient to change our ration ingredients? If we look at switching out soy that has a high carbon cost because of deforestation, and replacing it with something else, is that going to be cost effective? It depends on what you're replacing it with. And at the end of the day, that's got to be a conversation with yourself and your nutritionist or your feed representative. It can be cost efficient. It also can be more cost intensive. And then we've got capital heavy. So renewables, there is a payback period on renewables, but the upfront investment cost is very high. Or infrastructure upgrades. If we want to upgrade our infrastructure in order to limit calf pneumonia, let's say, That's a very capital heavy investment. It may pay back at some point, but that's going to be over a longer term. So far, I've tried to just set the scene of why we're doing carbon footprints and how linked carbon efficiency is with cost efficiency. And we'll look into some further examples now. So this is from a project that a couple of team members from the sustainability team at Promar did at Littleton Dairy. And here you have a relationship between the herds. Each individual circle here is a cow, and we have referenced them against profitable lifetime index and also the herd percentile ranking. And this is on that genomic data, and we've been able to do this, which is absolutely fantastic. And we see a really good relationship between the herd percentile ranking and profitable lifetime index, so how profitable they're likely to be. We can then cross-reference them with on EnviroCal, which is AHDB's kind of genetics matrix that tries to signal which genetic traits lead to a more environmentally friendly cow. And what we see here is that EnviroCal index is matched with the profitable lifetime index. So we've got a correlation between profitability and sustainability already. If we build on this further, now Genus, the sister company of Promar, has this Profit Max New Era group. So what they do with New Era Angus and Blue genetics is they take all of this genomic data out of their progeny and they put them into buckets. And the buckets are based on how well they achieve over a certain period when it comes to feed efficiency and carcass weight, slaughter age, and everything like that. And then they've been able to categorize them into base. It does what it's expected. Standard, profit plus, so you get a little bit of benefit, and then profit max. And similar genetics companies will, other than Genus, will be doing something as well as this. So please have a look at whoever's supplying your genetics. And as well we're going to be talking about beef on dairy here and beef, but on the sheep side, I know there's the Breed for Change with Innovis, which looks at something similar here. So please do look into that. So on the left here, we can see that for the Profit Max group, the carcass weight that they are finishing with at the same amount of days is higher. So it's 323 instead of 317. Which means they are more feed efficient. They are converting that feed into carcass weight, which is fantastic. We can see that for this group, they're also reducing slaughter age, so 62 days difference. 62 days is a big amount of time if you imagine how much ration is going into that progeny per day, especially when they're at that top end size. So days to slaughter, we've gone from 583 of base, which is still good, to 521 for Profit Max. So what does that mean? Well, in terms of profitability, there's a £180 difference. £180 difference between base and Profit Max, and that's faster growth rates, fewer days to slaughter, improved feed efficiency, and valuable carcasses as well, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, if we switch that and start talking about sustainability, what do we see here? Well, we also see quite a drop in the carbon intensity. So we've just put £180 per head on that animal and also dropped from 4.35 kilograms of CO2. And that's a lot lower than the figures of beef I've put before, because we're talking about beef on dairy. So we're producing multiple products in a system. But figuratively speaking, we're dropping from 4.3 to, what is that? Just above 3.6. £180 difference. And we've made a massive reduction on emissions intensity. I'm rambling on slightly, but I just want to end on another example, and I'm going to keep this data anonymous, but this is one of the farms that we work with. We painted a picture, and this is a beef finishing farm. We painted a picture of the whole herd, and we took some measurements, and we said, right, your average days to slaughter is about 690. but your best is 606. So there are some in this herd that are getting up to weight at 606 days, which is absolutely fantastic. Now let's model this and see what happens on a carbon footprint in a carbon footprint lens. So we modeled and said, what happens if we put, if we say all of the beef is going to go down to 606 days? In total, they produce 15% less manure. So it's about, I think it's a 13% reduction in days, but they produce 15% less manure because they're producing more manure when they are older and heavier. That's 21% less feed that we were putting into that animal. The animal that finishes at 606 days in comparison is to 694 is eating 21% less feed. And that is translating through methane foregone purchase feed and foregone manure deposited. That is resulting in a 33% reduction in carbon footprint, which I think we can all agree is a really good indication of what we can achieve here. So it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. In conclusion, carbon efficiency can be used as a management tool. I would not recommend that it replaces a management tool if you already have one, but it is very good at, and it always compares you with people in the industry. Just make sure that you are comparing yourself against people who have a similar enterprise type, because there is no reason why to compare yourself with someone that's uncomparable to you. But they are very, very good at showing you where your carbon sits and where you can become more carbon efficient. And the link between carbon efficiency and efficiency on farm is very, very strong. Don't worry if that carbon footprint also kind of undulates over time. We need to build a picture over about 5 or 6 years. If you have a bad climatic event, if there's a drought or anything like that, yes, your carbon footprint will be affected, but yes, your efficiency on farm is also affected. So we need to take a trend picture over time. I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening for that slide section, and hand back to Nathan, because I think we're going to have a bit of a discussion.
Really interesting presentation. It's great to see how paying attention to a farm's carbon footprint, especially translated through the genetics, like you've shown, can have so many benefits to the farm business. Like you say, I have a few questions for you now from our supply base about the topic. So if you wouldn't mind, the first question I have here is, could you just summarize briefly for our listeners, what is the benefit of carbon footprinting to the farmer?
Sure. I don't know where to start. There's a lot of benefits to the farmer for carbon footprint. I would say that as someone who kind of specializes in carbon accounting. But as I kind of finished off with there, it's a new lens on farm management. So carbon footprinting allows you to view your farm in a lens that you perhaps aren't viewing your farm in before. You might collect a few key performance indicators. They might be jotted down on a piece of paper, they might be in your head, they might be in management software tool. What carbon footprints allow you to do is produce key performance indicators year on year that compares you with a pool of people. And I think that's quite important when you're looking at efficiency. I think on a wider lens, we've also got to position ourselves in the industry as people who work with the land and care about the environment. And I know we all do. Of course we do, but there's a little bit of a mismatch between agriculture and environmentalism going on at the minute. And I think carbon footprints, understanding our carbon, and then eventually getting to understand our carbon sequestration, and it's going to be a lot more of a positive message, is really, really important to position us in a space that say, yes, I produce this really good quality meat. I know the carbon intensity of this meat. It's important to share that with consumers and clients. And I think the more transparent we will be, the better position we'll be in when it does become easier to kind of estimate that carbon sequestration as well.
That's great. Yeah, there definitely is a really positive story out there. out
Mhm.
there when it comes to carbon footprints. So second question I have in now, Hattie. Um, I know you had a slide in your presentation that sort of touched on this, but just to bring it up again, could you give some practical examples of the sort of changes a farmer could make based on their carbon footprint results?
Yeah, sure. It's going to be quite important to look at it from a farm to farm basis, but we do see a lot of uh I guess similarities between the what we see here, and it's based around number one, I think, would be genetics. Now, genetics are really important anyway, but I know more about beef genetics than I do about lamb genetics, so forgive me here. But looking at traits that are suitable to your farm are really, really important here, and especially when we're not trying to make a farm kind of pick genetics that are more suited to other elsewhere in the country, and other breed types, and that kind of thing. But genetics is really important to promote that feed efficiency. Second, I would talk about feed. It comes with a really high carbon cost, especially soy. Now we've got the legislation coming through in the EU that is basically saying we can't feed soy that has had deforestation attached to it anymore. That is going to impact our carbon footprint. It's important to look at that now, and try and get a plan in place. Um, Thirdly, I'd say fertility is really, really important as well. There are measurements all out there, and kind of, especially from AHDB, saying how much it costs for per day to not have something in calf, or in lamb. We know that, but it has a big um, weight on the carbon footprint. If you think about your product being animals, as in per head, if you can distribute that carbon cost over more animals, then it's going to be better. And this it's the same for mortality. So if you lose um, even 6-7% of your herd, the carbon cost of that 7% is then distributed over all the other meat you produce. So it's the reason why I feel so strongly that carbon is linked to efficiency is because I could have given you, everybody's been talking about those recommendations for quite a while, just on a farm efficiency basis. And we're hearing the same recommendations come up when we talk about carbon. And it's important to kind of link the two together.
Yeah, definitely. So for a couple of those changes that you described, Hattie, could you maybe explain how some of those would maybe increase the profitability for the farm? So I know you touched on genetics and feed and fertility there. So if you'd maybe just hone in on an example maybe of how that making a change in one of those areas might increase the profitability for that specific farm.
Yeah, sure. I think the easiest one to look at there is genetics. And following this call, I can definitely send some really good data that we've got from the genus guys that have done this time after time, and seen really good results from it. But if we look from a genetics perspective, um, and we start to focus on feed efficiency, the rate that that animal can convert feed into meat basically translates into feed foregone. So you are then not paying for feed for what it can be up to whatever 20-30 days that you might have been before, because they're just generally slower to convert that feed. So focusing on genetics, focusing on feed is a very good example, because I think we all kind of focus on the cost of feed a lot here. We probably, all of us, know how much it takes to feed our flock or our herd for X amount of time. That is feed forgone if we're selecting the right genetics. I'll get a document together and put some stats there as well if we can attach it to this webinar, because they're really interesting reads out there.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. Thanks very much for that, Hattie. Another question in now. So This farmer asks, what should a farmer do if they have calculated their carbon footprint and it is low already?
Celebrate. Number one, feel proud of yourself. I think it's important that carbon footprints aren't just associated with bad news. If you have got a really low carbon footprint, then make sure you are also comparing yourself against other people who have a really low carbon footprint. So I'm thinking of more intense herds or flocks. You will have a higher you'll probably have a higher level of total emissions because you've got maybe a bigger herd size going on. Let's say you're intensive kind of indoor finisher, you will likely have a lower carbon footprint per kilogram of meat that's happening here. But of course, when we take carbon sequestration into the mix, then the more indoor intensive, highly stocked farms are going to have less sequestration happening on farm than potentially those that have more land to distribute their animals across. So if you've already got a low carbon footprint, you've done a really good job. Think about total emissions. And then in the UK, often we're only talking about 2 or 3% decreases. When we start talking about other countries, we can start talking about 20% or 30% decreases. However, if you can knock 1% off renewable energies, if you can knock a 0.5 percentage off your mortality, it's still a win, and it's still a win for efficiency. I will be gobsmacked if there's absolutely nothing that can be done, even if it's just 0.5% here and there. But if anybody does have a really low carbon footprint, and those doing beef on dairy will have a lower carbon footprint, about 6 or 7 kilograms of CO2, then it's a good starting place. Let's turn our attention to soil health and start talking about carbon sequestration if we don't want to talk about emissions mitigations anymore.
Yeah, that's great. Um, but I suppose, like you say, the important thing when you're making comparisons is to be sure that you're comparing like for like. So you're comparing your carbon footprint to other farms with the same system type rather than trying to compare, say, a beef on dairy herd to a suckler herd or to a finisher herd. You know,
Exactly.
yeah, that's really the learning point there. So a bit of a broader question in now. And again, you touched on this in the presentation, but why is it important for a farmer to get their carbon footprint calculated either on an individual level or maybe across the industry?
Yeah, I think I've touched on the individual level more than I've touched on the industry level. The individual level, I'll sound like a broken record, but looking at that different management perspective is important. And also just having it, like, knowing what your product is producing on a carbon level. It's good to know, and you will get asked at some point, whether that's someone who's in the industry or what. On an industry level, I strongly believe that we've got a really important path to go down when it comes to transparency around carbon emissions. I'm going to have to pick what I say quite carefully, because a lot of the industry data can be improved upon. It's down to data accuracy, and the more farms that we have reporting their carbon emissions, the better we're going to get there. And from what we've seen already so far, is that when you focus on data accuracy, it more often than not, it has a beneficial impact on your carbon footprint if we can get more accurate data. And as I said before, we're good at producing beef and lamb in the UK, that shows in our carbon footprint. If we get more people feeding into that, I think it's only going to be a better and better story. And so you get processors like yourselves who kind of understand this and say, right, let's do something about that. Let's try and kind of support the messaging around our industry by getting more transparent around carbon efficiency and getting a better and more accurate representative footprint for our products.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Hattie. So just to wrap up, I've got a final question in here. If someone has been listening to this and they decide that they'd like to find out their farm's carbon footprint, what would you recommend that they do next?
Um, if they are a Dunbia supplier, get in touch with yourselves. If there are there are DEFRA resilience funding. If you are in England and want to get your carbon footprint done, please look into that. We provide that service. Other consultancies provide that service also. And then there are tools out there that you can use. I won't name them. I'm not affiliated to any of them. We have our own at Promar, but we also do use some of those freely accessible tools. Have a look. There's AgriCalc, Cool Farm Tool, loads of them. Have a look at them and start seeing what data they need you to collect and just get in touch. There's loads of people who are doing their carbon footprint and there's lots of help out there. I know there are some guides on YouTube and that kind of thing. So yeah, reach out.
Perfect. Just one more thing when you mentioned the tools, Hattie.
Mhm.
I know it can be a bit challenging whenever there is such a diversity in the number of tools. You know, there's such a breadth of tools available. So do you have any specific recommendations, maybe not in tool per se, but what a farmer should be looking for whenever they
Yeah,
go out to find a tool to get their carbon footprint calculated?
yeah, sure. There's a bit of a kind of mantra in the industry at the minute that all these tools are doing different things, and I don't know which tool to go for. Um, the tools that are out there at the minute are all compliant or very nearly compliant with kind of IPCC methodology and ISO standards. The tools that aren't have made a conscious decision. They know what those standards are, and they've made a conscious decision to say, I disagree slightly with you here, and I'm gonna do something else here. Um, as long as you stick to the same tool every year, you will see a trend. It doesn't necessarily matter where you're sitting unless it's really, really bad or really, really good, and we want to interview you and shout about you in the industry. But it that doesn't matter per se. It's sticking with the same tool so that you can compare yourself with yourself. That's the most important part. Um, the variability in tools is only because some tools focus on a particular sector more than others. There are tools there designed for dairy, and there are tools there that are designed to get dairy, beef, lamb, pigs, poultry all under the same tool. So yeah, I any of the big names out there, just start with those.
That's perfect. Those are all the questions we have for you today, Hattie. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and once again, thank Hattie for joining us today. It's been a really interesting and informative session, so thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.